by silver set sail, cruising all through the night. The guards at the door try to put up a fight. They said, ain't nothing here for you people to claim. Every single kid here looks the same. When he shouted these words, the kids came alive. They could see the parents right in front of their eyes, grabbing the stuff without saying goodbye. Kicking and screaming, they started to cry.
Sorry about that. How's everybody doing? It's great to be with you, learning on a Wednesday evening. Last night, I had some buddies over, and we had just a friendly poker game. It's been going on for years, somewhat irregularly. We're not even once a month guys, more like, a couple times a year. But at any rate, the game's been going on for a long time. And I was just getting terrible cards and playing them badly, just losing money, losing chips for the whole first hour that we were playing. And then I finally had a good hand, and it was really good. It wasn't great, but it was really good. And the pot was getting quite large because other players were in it. And I just said a little thing, I had a little thought inside my head. I made a little deal with God. And I said, if I win this hand, I will immediately, set aside 20% of this pot to give to charity. And I actually won the hand. And I did something, the etiquette's a little questionable. I counted how much I won in that pot. Counted my winnings right then and there because I just needed to know how much I had to set aside that I was going to be sure to give to charity, that 20%. So in my mind, I made a little deal that I always give away 10% of income to charity. But here I said it was going to be 20 if I won this pot, and even if I lost money for the rest of the evening. So did I do the right thing? Was it okay to make such a deal with God that if I win that hand, that I would give an extra amount to charity? Is that a good thing to do or a bad thing to do? We're going to be answering that question during our discussion of today's page. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather to do a little bit of learning on a Wednesday evening? Paula in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, Sharon in New Jersey, Paula in the Great Northwest, John in Maine, James in Indianapolis, Yehuda in South Carolina, John in Sedona, Patrice in Utah, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Paula in Oregon, Toby, where are you, Toby? Toby in South Central Texas, Renee in Indiana, and John says, I do that with the lottery, except my deal with Hashem is that if I win, it all goes to charity. That's good. I like that a lot. Okay, and over on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Tonight's class is sponsored by Jeannie and Michael Schechter in honor of the healing of their great-granddaughter, Autumn, who has a broken arm from a difficult birth on October 6th, just last week. So, Jeannie and Michael, first of all, may Autumn have a refuah shlema, a complete healing of mind and body, should have no pain, should heal quickly. Thank God babies generally do heal quickly. Her mom should be okay. The parents should be okay. Everyone in your family should be okay. You and all your loved ones should be showered in blessings in the merit of you sponsoring our learning today and enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. And we say Amen. Where are we holding? We are in Tractate Rosh Hashana, the 9th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Rosh Hashana, as you might have guessed. We are in chapter 1 and continuing our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 1. We've established that according to the sages, there are 4 different New Year's days in the Hebrew calendar. And the first of these was the first of Nisan, the first of the spring month of Nisan, the same month that contains Passover in it. For what is this the new year? For measuring the number of years that a king has reigned. And as we saw, this applies to the Jewish kings of Israel. But when we're talking about foreign kings, we measure the years of their monarchy, the years of their rule, according to the regular calendar, meaning according to the regular Hebrew calendar. And for that, the beginning of the year is Rosh Hashana, right? So the head of the new year is the fall month of Tishrei, the month of Tishrei, and its first day is Rosh Hashana, and that's the first day of the year for most calendar purposes. But when we're talking about the years that a king has reigned, the Jewish king, then we measure from the first day of Nisan and Passover, and this whole idea that the calendar was reset, as it were, when God redeemed us from slavery in Egypt. And now the Jews would have a different scheme of time. But we wouldn't celebrate Rosh Hashanah on the first day of Nisan. The calendar, as it were, dating back to the time of creation, would still be the calendar. But for certain purposes, we would observe a new year at different times. And one of these is for counting the years of the reign of this monarch. Then the sages introduced this contradiction that for some foreign kings, the years, the tally of their years of their reign is measured in the same way from the first of Nisan, like it is for Jewish kings. So, and yet for other foreign kings, it's not. So how do we reconcile that seeming contradiction? And we had the opinion yesterday that said, well, if it's a foreign king, but he's a righteous king, meaning he recognizes that there is one God, and presumably he's good to the Jewish people, then he could be considered a righteous king, and his years might be counted in a more friendly manner, as it were, in the same way that we would count the years of one of our own kings. And so then, and where we are now is, so if he's a righteous king, we're going to measure from the same date that we would for a Jewish king. But how do we decide if such a king is a righteous king? And so yesterday the idea was introduced that, and it's unclear who, right? Whether Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes were all the same king, or if they were sort of on the same plan, with operating with the same intention. But at any rate, the king or kings of Persia, who were sort of ruling the largest empire in the world at the time that the second temple was allowed to be built in the time of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai. At that time, the foreign king who enabled us to rebuild the temple and build the second temple, that was a pretty righteous thing to do. And so we might consider such a king to be a righteous king and measure his years the way we would measure for a Jewish king. But the sages aren't so sure. They don't all agree. And this is a very important thing to remember, and it'll be kind of extra important as we go through today's page, that the Talmud is not one voice, not even close, right? The Mishnah was edited by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but in editing it, he was just deciding the order that all these different opinions would appear in, and which included and which not. But the Talmud is a record over centuries, many centuries of many debates among many sages. Sometimes there's majority opinions, but minority opinions are preserved. Sometimes you will hear something very shocking, something challenging, something difficult to hear, something none of us would agree with in the Talmud. And then we shouldn't say, well, the Talmud says. people often use that phrase to quote something they read in the Talmud, the Talmud says, but really there's no voice of the Talmud. Sometimes that means a majority opinion that was preserved and became the law. Okay, that's a little bit like the sages say, or the Mishna says, the Gemara says, even the Talmud says. But even when you talk about a majority opinion, sometimes, many centuries later, the world changed so much that the sages of that generation had to change the law. There was it's very rare that happens later than the time of the sages, but it can happen. And so, and many more times in the Talmud, we will encounter very unpopular opinions, very difficult opinions, very obscure opinions, very illogical opinions, sometimes even downright offensive opinions. And you can't say that is the voice of the Jewish people, or that is the voice of the sages, or the voice of the Talmud, because there's no such thing. Similar to, similar to like what is the voice of the American, U.S. Record of judicial opinions that have been offered, by various courts over the whole history of the United States. I mean, yeah, there's legal precedents that become the law until they're overruled later. But there have been many judges issuing many opinions, and sometimes when they explain an opinion or just give, what really is not a legal opinion, but a personal opinion that kind of comes out within a judicial opinion, like that is not the voice of the United States. We just have to acknowledge who is speaking, in what context is that person speaking, for what purpose is that person speaking. Sometimes the sages engage in hyperbole, and they're not meant to be taken seriously even within the passage under discussion, let alone thousands of years later looking back with some greater perspective. So I just want us to keep in mind that there's no such thing as the voice of the Talmud. We always have to ask, who is speaking, in what context, why are they speaking, what are they trying to address? Okay. So now what we're trying to do is decide whether this king, if he was indeed one person, but let's start by saying King Cyrus, who originally issued the opinion, yes, the Jews can rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. The first temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. About 50 years later, the Babylonian Empire was conquered by the Persian Empire, and that's why you now have a Persian king who is the one who's going to okay the reconstruction of the temple. And big difference between the Persians and the Babylonians, the state religion, as it were, of the Persians was Zoroastrianism, which is a monotheistic religion. Very different than Judaism, but it is a monotheistic religion as opposed to the Babylonians, who were, idolaters with a pantheon of gods. So that's another big difference. Okay. All right. So, okay. So the Gemara notes that as we're discussing, so we're saying that this person was all the same one. Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes was the same person. That's where we left off yesterday. So the Gemara notes, in any case, it is difficult, as in one place his years are counted from Nisan, like a Jewish king, whereas in another place they're counted from Tishrei, like a foreign king, meaning that sometimes he's considered a righteous king, a righteous foreign king, whose years are counted like a Jewish king, and sometimes he's considered not like a righteous foreign king, in which case he's counted like any other foreign king. And so Rabbi Yitzhak said, well, this is not difficult, as it can be explained as follows. Here, where his years are counted from Nisan, like the kings of Israel, it speaks of him before he became corrupt. Whereas there, where his years are counted from Tishrei, it speaks of him after he became corrupt. So now we're encountering the idea that, well, Cyrus, who would seemingly be very righteous because he okayed the rebuilding of the temple for the Jewish people, so at that point, he's certainly not corrupt. So you might think, well, maybe he was corrupt before, then he showed that he was a friend of the Jewish people, and so then we no longer considered him a corrupt king. But here, the text is saying he was considered a righteous king, and then later he was considered a corrupt king. So what happened for Cyrus that his status in the eyes of the sages became so diminished at a certain point in his life? Rav Kahana strongly objects to this explanation. Did he really become corrupt after Ezra led the exiles back to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the temple and create the second temple? But isn't it written, this is from the book of Ezra, chapter 6, verse 9, and, quote, "And that which they need, both young bulls and rams and lambs, for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, as well as wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the word of the priests who are at Jerusalem, let it be given to them day by day without fail." Now, this would seem to indicate that King Cyrus said, not only are you allowed to rebuild your temple, but I am going to make sure that you have, the material wealth to offer the daily offerings that are required to be given in that temple. Right? The returning exiles were an impoverished lot. We've read this elsewhere. The Jews who came back to populate Israel after the Babylonian exile were like a small and impoverished group, and it was not easy for them just to, have all the animal sacrifices that were going to be needed for the daily offerings. And here's this wonderful, magnanimous offer from the king of the Persian Empire. It says, I will give you what you need. I'll make sure you have all the animals that you need to offer the sacrifices on a daily basis. Sounds like a righteous king. And doesn't Cyrus's contribution to the temple demonstrate his fear of heaven, right? He's going to enable the Jews to worship. Why? Just because he likes the Jews? No, because he has awe of God and wants the temple to serve God in the right way through its sort of messengers, the Jewish people. So Rabbi Yitzhak said to Rav Kahana, my teacher, a refutation can be brought from your own burden, i.e. from the text you yourself cited. As the next verse, Ezra 6:10, continues, that they may pay sacrifice offerings of sweet savor to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and of his sons. This shows that Cyrus did this solely for his own benefit, so that the Jews would sacrifice offerings and pray for him and his sons. So it's not just that he generally had this, awe, fear of heaven, this awe of God, and wanted to cause God to be served properly on earth so that all the offerings would be present at God's resting place on earth, the temple, when it was rebuilt. But rather, it was sort of like, whatever his religion is over in Persia, he's going to cover his bases. He's wealthy enough. He's going to say, well, I'll have my Zoroastrian priests do what they do on my behalf in my country, and I'll have the Jewish priests do what they do over their temple in Jerusalem, all of them praying for me and the health of my family, and that way the king's family will be covered. So the suggestion here that Rabbi Yitzhak is saying to Rav Kahana is that, well, Cyrus was corrupt. Okay, he enabled offerings to be brought in Jerusalem, but he did that from a purely selfish motive, just to sort of, as a health insurance and a life insurance for his own family. He's hedging his bets. So the Gemara challenges this challenge of Rabbi Yitzhak. The Gemara says, and one who acts in this manner, is he not acting not just in a satisfactory fashion, but the Gemara says, is he not acting in an exemplary fashion? Isn't it taught in a baraisa, if one gives charity, saying, I give this sela, this coin, for charity, in order that my children may live, or if he says, I give this coin in order that through it I may merit life in the world to come. Not, I give charity because there are needy people in the world who need it, but rather, I give charity because I want to get a blessing for my family, or I give charity because I want to make sure that I have a good spot in the next world when I go to the world of souls. If a person does this, according to this baraisa, he is still considered a full-fledged righteous person. Not just a righteous person, but a completely righteous person. a full-fledged righteous person? If so, what was wrong with the king bringing offerings so that the Jews would pray for his life and the life of his children? What's wrong with that? So right here, what we see is that the sages are having a debate about this very interesting question, right? If you have ulterior motives for giving charity, the little example I gave last night is like, God, if I win this big pot that's on the poker table, I'm going to give, not just 10% of it to charity. I'm going to give 20% of it to charity. A little deal that I made in my mind with God. So, is that a terrible ulterior motive that completely discredits the fact that after the pot, let's say it was a $100 pot, that I'm going to give $20 to charity? And now the $20 doesn't really mean anything because the deal in my mind was, well, I'll give it, but really what I want to do is win the pot? Or is it irrelevant what your motive is? Because the fact is, there's needy people in the world, and when you give money to charity, who cares what you does the recipient of the charity care while you're giving the charity? Does the guy who has 10 kids and can't put dinner on the table care what little deal somebody made in their mind with God when they gave charity, and now this person is going to be able to enjoy like a full dinner and feed his kids? Does he care if money comes in to pay the rent? Does he care if money comes in to pay for medical bills? No, I don't think he cares. I think the recipient of the charity is thrilled to receive it, no matter what the reason was. And a teaching that we have in Pirkei Avos, so the chapters of the fathers, is give, right? Give even if you give for the wrong reason. Do a mitzvah even if you do it for the wrong reason. Because by accustoming yourself to give and accustoming yourself to fulfill commandments and accustoming yourself to do mitzvahs, even for the wrong reason, eventually you'll come to do it for the right reason. Right? And then you can fulfill the other precept that's in Pirkei Avos, which says you should serve the God not like a servant who is seeking a reward, but rather a servant who serves because he loves his master. Right? Really, the reason we should do good in the world, do righteous deeds in the world, is because we know that's what God expects of us, and we're so overflowing with gratitude to God. No matter what difficulties we're facing, the fact that we're alive in this world, and that truly most of us, are enjoying so many blessings in our lives. If we're not sick, if we're well, if we have a roof over our heads, we have clothes to wear, and if we have many more blessings that we could look at, we should be so grateful for those that we're just looking for opportunities to serve God by serving and helping God's creatures. Right? But if we can't summon that kind of motivation in ourselves, then any motivation will do, as long as we're fulfilling our obligations and we are giving money to charity. Now, elsewhere the sages said you shouldn't give so much money to charity that you impoverish yourself, because then you're actually acting as a bad partner to God. God makes us God's partner in serving all the creatures by saying, we're going to tithe, right? We're going to get, let's say we're giving 10% of our income to charity. Great. Then the more income we make, the more we're going to be able to give to charity. If you give so much that you impoverish yourself and then threaten your livelihood, then, next year you're not going to be able to give. And so, you want to do well in your life. You want to earn well. Not that it's your sole focus, but it's okay to want to have prosperity, as long as you have it clear in your mind that a very definite, strict portion of that, at least 10%, and if it's 20%, even better, is going to go directly to righteous causes. Okay, so now we come back to Cyrus. If Cyrus enabled this impoverished remnant of the Jewish people who are repopulating Israel after the Babylonian exile to rebuild the temple, and he's providing them with the wealth to have the animal offerings that are going to be offered in that temple, then the fact that he's doing it because it should be a blessing to himself and his family, or because he should have a place in the world to come, who cares? He's enabling a great good to be done, and he should be accounted a righteous king, and then therefore his years should be counted like any Jewish king. Why would we consider that he became corrupt? Because his motivation was questionable? That's going to be rejected. But the fact is, his years were counted differently. So right now, we're still sort of working through, well, maybe it's because he really, the fact that his motivation was faulty in giving those offerings is why he might be considered a corrupt king. So we're still working through that argument. Now, here comes something that's a little bit, challenging for us to read, right? So the Gemara asks, and one who acts in this manner, is he not acting in exemplary fashion? Isn't it taught that one who says, I'll give this coin for charity so that my children may live, or so that I will earn a place in the world to come, is considered a full-fledged righteous person? And if so, what was wrong with the king bringing offerings so that the Jews would pray for his life and the life of his children? The Gemara answers, La Kasha, this is not difficult. Here in the case of one who makes his charity conditional, yet is considered to be a righteous person, this is referring to a Jew. And this is because even if his condition is not fulfilled, he will not complain to God, meaning he will stay in relationship with God because, we have so many mitzvahs that we have to live up to. We're going to stay in this very tight relationship with God. However, there where Cyrus was not given credit for his good deed because it was conditional, it is referring to the other nations of the world. Because a person from there may come to regret his actions and complain to God if his condition is not fulfilled. In other words, he'll enter into a relationship with God, see how it goes. If he doesn't get the blessings that he was looking for, it's like, enough of this. And now he no longer has that relationship with God. That's going to be a different kind of relationship than, at least according to the sages here, a Jew would have with God. Now, this is obviously a little bit of Jewish exceptionalism in the opinion of the sages, but it makes sense in the sense that somebody's just going to give, to the God of the Hebrews in order to get a reward, and then he doesn't get that reward, so he could easily just cancel the relationship. But the Jew stays in relationship with God because he can't walk away from it. If you're born a Jew or you convert to Judaism, you're a Jew forever. You can never not be a Jew, so you're always going to be in that relationship. And if you wish, say, from where do we derive that Cyrus became corrupt? Now it's a different theory of why he became corrupt. Not because he gave for the wrong reasons, which basically they're rejecting, but rather, as it is written with regard to the building of the temple, that he issued the following command. Let the house be built with 3 rows of great stones and a row of new timber, and let the expense be paid out of the king's house. Now he's funding the construction of the temple. Sounds great. How can we find fault in that? But why did he do it in this manner and command that the temple be built with a row of timber? He thought, if the Jews rise up against me, I will burn their temple with fire, and it will be more flammable because of the wood that I'm commanding to be built into the second temple. But the Gemara raises a question. Is that to say that Solomon did not do the very same thing when he built the first temple? Isn't it written in 1 Kings 6:36, and he built the inner court, 3 rows of hewn stone and a row of cedar beams. Stone and cedar, right? Stone and wood. And the Gemara answers, there's a big difference. Solomon placed the wood above the stone foundation, so that even if the temple were burned, the stone foundation would remain. But Cyrus placed the wood below, so that if he were to set fire to the temple, the whole structure would collapse. Also, Solomon sunk the wood into the building in order to make it less flammable, whereas Cyrus did not sink it into the building. Furthermore, Solomon plastered the wood over with plaster to prevent it from catching fire, whereas Cyrus did not plaster the wood over with plaster to make it less flammable. So we have the idea that why was Cyrus considered a righteous king at one point and later considered a corrupt king? He was considered righteous when he, allowed and even enabled the construction of the second temple. But when they looked a little more closely at how he did that, they saw that he was actually, building in a trap door, as it were, that if the, Jews became a political problem for him, he could swoop in and just destroy that temple. And maybe that's the reason that they were suspicious of him. Rav Yosef said, and some say that it was Rabbi Yitzhak who said, from where do we derive that Cyrus became corrupt? Now, another theory, not because his motivation was bad when making donations, not because he built in, this trapdoor that could cause the temple to be vulnerable to fire, but rather a third reason that we could consider him corrupt. Rabbi Yitzhak said, from where do we derive that Cyrus became corrupt? From here, as it is written, this is Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 6, and the king said to me, the consort, Shegal, also sitting by him, for how long shall your journey be? And when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. We saw that verse yesterday. When Nehemiah went and, this is when he had the conversation with Cyrus and said, Cyrus said, you're here in my court. Why are you so sad? Well, that stuff's not going well for my people. In Jerusalem, it's totally destroyed. Everything is obliterated. My people are impoverished and we can't worship our God as we're commanded to do because there's no temple. And the king said, all right, you can go to Jerusalem, but just make sure you come back after you get that construction underway. I like having you here. And Nehemiah was happy and went and returned. In telling that story, Nehemiah mentions that when he was talking to the king, there were other people around him, including this Shegal, Shegal as it's spelled, transliterated in English, but Hashegal, Vav He Shin Gimel Lamed. This word Shagal, right? What is the Shagal, let's say. Shegal. What is this Shegal? So what is the meaning of the word Shegal in the verse? And Rabba Bar Lima said in the name of Rav, it means a she-dog, a female dog that sat next to him, which he used for sexual relations. Now the Gemara raises a difficulty. However, if that is so, then there is a contradiction from that which is written about a different king, Belshazzar. For where it says in Daniel 5:23, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your consorts, Shegal, and your concubines have drunk wine in them. If Shegal means a female dog, does a female dog drink wine? It would seem that this was alluding not to some female dog, but rather just some woman that was there, some concubine, or what do you call the royal prostitute, basically, that was available to the king. That would make more sense in this context, not the female dog if she was drinking wine. And the Gemara raises another difficulty. However, if that is so, there's also a contradiction from that which is written in Psalm 45, verse 10. King's daughters are among your favorites. Upon your right hand stands a consort, Shegal, in gold of Ophir. Now, if Shegal is a she-dog, what is the prophet heralding for the Jewish people? And the Gemara explains this is what the prophet is saying. In reward for the Torah being as precious to the Jews as a she-dog is to these other people, you merited the gold of Ophir. Now, this is getting very difficult, right? Very challenging. And if you wish, say, actually, the word Shegal in all these other contexts means consort, but Rabba Bar Lima had a tradition that in connection only with Cyrus, specifically with Cyrus, elsewhere it just means a royal consort, but here, with regard to Cyrus, they have a tradition that the word Shegal refers to a female dog. And why was it called a Shegal, this female dog? It is because the dog was as precious to him as a consort, or else because he set the dog next to him in place of a consort. So maybe he was engaging in some kind of bestiality with this dog, or maybe it was just like the king's lapdog that he treated with greater favor, than humans, right? Like humans just come and go to him, but he could lavish love and affection on this little lapdog, even at the same time that he was sending, people who just happened to annoy him to be executed, right, by the royal executioner. And now you could start to see why, accusations of corruption and, being morally repugnant would be leveled at a king who's lavishing attention on a lapdog while being very cruel to human subjects in his kingdom. And if you wish to say a different way to approach why we consider that Cyrus is considered corrupt later in his reign than he was earlier, and if you wish, say, from where do we derive that Cyrus became corrupt? It is from here, as it is stated in Ezra 7:22, up to 100 talents of silver, and up to 100 measures of wheat, and up to 100 bath of wine, and up to 100 bath of oil, and salt without prescribed limit. What is this referred to? This is how much he's saying you can use to make gifts in the temple. This is citing why he's corrupt? What? What are they saying? Initially, he gave without setting a limit, but now he introduced a limit, right? He was giving what was needed to help the Jews serve God in their temple. And then he said, well, actually, I'm going to cap that. You can't just give as much as you want. This is the limit of what you can give. Is that, evidence that he became corrupt? In fact, the Gemara rejects this argument. But perhaps initially he did not know what limit to set, as he was not familiar with the daily needs of the temple. And afterward, when the matter became clarified, he set an appropriate limit. What's wrong with that? Rather, it is clear, as we initially answered, that the evidence that Cyrus became corrupt is based on his relationship with his consort rather than anything having to do with his donations to the temple. And so I think what we're seeing here is, it's pretty interesting. It's a good lesson to remember. The sages are saying this king was good to the Jews. That his policy was good to the Jews. He enabled them to rebuild the second temple. He even gave of his own wealth so that there would be sacrifices made in the temple. Those actions vis-a-vis the Jewish people were very good. We should have nothing to complain about. And nonetheless, in this man's personal life and with regard to other rulings that he made in his kingdom, he engaged in some reprehensible practices. It's almost like, you look back on last year and the year before, and all these big executives, who were running their companies and making a profit for their shareholders and, maintaining very righteous seeming profiles in the world and giving large amounts of money to charity, etc. But they were, misogynists who were abusing women or abusing people in the workplace, engaging in sexual harassment in the workplace, etc. And then the world said, you know what? We're not going to tolerate that anymore. The fact that you're doing a lot of things that are good professionally, but in your personal life, you are morally reprehensible is not going to cut it. You can't, sort of bifurcate your essence that way. And because you're good in one area, the fact that you're, morally repugnant in another is going to be allowed to wash. It's not. You have to consider the whole person. Now, I think the sages would also say that teshuvah is always possible. And so when you find, you have a figure in public life who's done a lot of good things, then it comes out and did something terrible, he has to be punished for that. He has to be held accountable for that. If he later goes through a real process of atonement and makes amends, then he can work his way back in to public life and to positions of importance. Not because somebody did something bad in their life that's going to be the sum total of who they are, and they remain canceled forever because of one thing that they did 20 years ago. But the fact is, you're going to be accountable for your righteous deeds and you're going to be accountable for your evil deeds. It all gets taken into consideration. And just because somebody was good to me, I'm not going to be allowed to ignore that he was bad to others or that he did a lot of terrible things. You have to take the whole package into consideration. I think that's the lesson we're learning here from the sage's evaluation of King Cyrus. All right, now we return to our Mishnah, that there are 4 different New Years. The first is from when we measure the number of years in a king's reign. And now we're going to the second idea of New Year's. And that is, and the Mishnah teaches, and also the first of Nisan is the new year for the order of the festivals. And the Gemara asks, is the new year for the festivals really on the first of Nisan? Isn't it on the 15th of Nisan? So we started to talk about this yesterday and the day before. What are the 3 major festivals? Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And in a solar year, they always go in that order. Passover in the spring, Shavuos in the summer, Sukkot in the fall. And that is a cycle. Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot. Now, between Shavuos and Sukkot comes Rosh Hashana. So the calendar year turns over. Sukkot in the fall, following, Shavuos, which is following Passover, the Sukkot that we just celebrated, that was in the calendar year, Hebrew calendar year, 5782. Passover and Shavuos were in the Hebrew calendar year, 5781. And yet, they're considered one cycle in that order. Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot. So for them, the new year is in the month of Nisan, not in the month of Tishrei. And the Gemara asks, and so now the Gemara asks, well, wait a minute. If that's the cycle, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, why are we talking about the first day of the month of Nisan? Why don't we say that the new year is the 15th of Nisan, which is when Passover actually hits? Since it's only about these 3 festivals, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, why would we talk about the first of Nisan? Why don't we say the new year is the 15th of Nisan? And Rav Chisda said, what the Mishnah means is that the festival that occurs in the month of Nisan is the new year for festivals. The point is that it goes in that order. The Gemara comments, this ruling makes a practical difference to one who makes a vow in order to determine when he is liable for violating the prohibition, you shall not delay. The Torah says if you make a vow to consecrate something and bring it as an offering in the temple, when the temple is standing, you shall not delay in bringing your vow. Now, back in ancient times, if you lived, a real distance from Jerusalem, let's say you live 200 miles away, right? Today, that's a 4-hour drive. It's not a big deal. You can move 200 miles even within the land of Israel. But, I think, but in ancient times, if you live 200 miles away from Jerusalem, that's a significant walk. That could be a 6-day walk until you get over there. So just because you made this vow doesn't mean you're going to now take a week-long trip traveling to Jerusalem, bring your offering in a week to come home. You're going to bring it the next time you make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which you're going to do for one of the festivals. So if you make that vow, let's say in July, and then you wait till Sukkot, did you delay? Did you violate the prohibition on delaying to bring your offering? What about if you make that vow in July and then you don't go back up, you don't go to Jerusalem for Sukkot, you don't go to Jerusalem until the following Passover? Did you violate the prohibition, you shall not delay? Or did you bring it in a timely enough fashion, even though you made the vow in July and you bring it the next April? Let's find out. So Rav Chisda said what the Mishnah means is that, so the Gemara comments, the ruling makes a practical difference to one who makes a vow. In order to determine when he's liable for violating the prohibition, you shall not delay. And the Mishnah was taught in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, as it is taught in a Baraisa. Whether one makes a vow to bring an offering to the temple, or he consecrates an item to give it to the temple, or he makes a valuation. In other words, he says that, my house is worth this much, or I am worth this much, and that amount of money I'm going to donate to the temple. And he's promising to pay the value of a particular person to the temple treasury. Once 3 festivals have passed from that day, and he has not yet fulfilled his promise, then he transgresses the prohibition, you shall not delay. As stated in the verse, when you shall vow a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in paying it. So according to this, let's say you make that vow in May, right, which is between Passover and Shavuos. And then you don't make your pilgrimage for Shavuos that year to Jerusalem. You don't go up for Sukkot either. If you then go up for Passover the following year and bring your offering, then you've done it in a timely way. But if you make that vow and then Shavuos passes and Sukkot passes and Passover passes and you still haven't brought your offering, now you have violated the prohibition, thou shalt not delay. Rabbi Shimon says, one transgresses the prohibition against delaying not when 3 festivals in a row have passed, but rather when 3 festivals have passed in their proper order. Since the new year of the festivals is in Nisan, the festivals in their proper order are Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot. You're not liable for, being late to bring your offering until Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot have all passed in that order from the time that you made your vow until you bring it. So in our example, where you made the vow in May, and then Shavuos passed, and then Sukkot passed, and then Passover came by, and you didn't go to Jerusalem for any of those, and you still haven't brought your offering, it's okay. You haven't violated the prohibition, thou shalt not delay. You will not have violated it until all 3 pass in that order. Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Meaning, if you make that vow in May, then a whole year goes by and it's May again. Now only Passover has passed, and you won't be liable until Passover, Shavuos, and Sukkot all have passed in that following year. Then you will have delayed too much, and you will be liable for violating this prohibition against thou shalt not delay. And that is the law. That is the halacha. I'm almost done. So if you've got questions or comments, get them in. And the sages taught in a baraisa with regard to those who are liable for vows of monetary payment. So in other words, what kinds of vows that you have to bring that are subject to this idea, thou shalt not delay, and if 3 festivals pass in their proper order, then you do become liable for delaying. If all three of those festivals pass and you haven't brought your offering, what kinds of offerings are we talking about? We're talking about a vow of monetary payment or a vow of valuations. Right? Valuations meaning people have certain values that are spelled out in the Torah, sort of depending on how old they are and what kind of person, etc. So according to that amount, you can say I give the erech valuation, and then that's just an amount. If you do that and you don't bring it when 3 of these festivals have passed in their proper order, then you become liable. What other kinds of offerings? Dedications, consecrations, sin offerings, guilt offerings, burnt offerings, peace offerings, vows of charity, tithes, firstborn offerings, animal tithes, paschal offerings, gleanings, forgotten sheaves, or produce of the corner of the field, 3 obligatory agricultural gifts that must be given to the poor. And for all of these, once 3 festivals have passed in their proper order, they transgress the prohibition, you shall not delay. The sages say any 3 passing, even if it goes Shavuos, Sukkot, Passover, if those 3 have passed, you're liable. But the law is according to Rabbi Shimon, who says all 3 have to pass in that order, Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, before you become liable. Now you owe an extra sin offering because you delayed in bringing what you were supposed to bring. That is what I have for us today. Let's go to your questions and comments. Rosh Hashana, page 4. Yakalala, is that the name? Said, my Hebrew language teacher called the Talmud the Wikipedia of Judaism. That's not bad. That's not bad. both because so much ends up in there. In a sense, it's a reference work, and the Talmud touches on sort of all aspects of life, and it holds so many different opinions. When I was saying earlier that there's no single voice of the Talmud, there are so many different voices recorded in the Talmud. But also it could be compared to Wikipedia a little bit in the sense that the Talmud is constantly cross-referencing to other parts of the Talmud. It's not just a list of laws that exist independently. The Talmud is always in conversation. The sages of the Talmud are always in conversation, not just with the people that they're debating on that particular page of the Talmud, but also it assumes that the reader has a vast encyclopedic knowledge of the whole Talmud and is constantly referencing laws and debates and ideas and stories and teachings from many, many other parts of the Talmud in the sense that it's hyperlinked to all other parts of the Talmud. And that's a little bit comparable to Wikipedia. So I like your analogy. Sharon, I thought Artaxerxes was Ahasuerus from the Purim story. Isn't that much later than Cyrus? There is an opinion that Artaxerxes is Ahasuerus from the Purim story. And definitely we've heard that the Purim story occurs during that 70 years of the Babylonian exile, and that Mordecai was a member of the Sanhedrin who had seen the fall of Jerusalem at the time that the first temple was destroyed. But as I mentioned yesterday, there's definitely going to be contradictions, first of all, between one sage and another about was Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, first of all, is he the same as Ahasuerus? Maybe, maybe not. And, whoever he is he the same person as Cyrus and Darius? Are they all the same person? Are they different people? Were there different kings that had the same name? Was there one king that had different names? We're going to get a lot of different opinions about that, and there's no dispositive answer to those questions. But for the purpose of the discussion that we were having here, it was helpful to offer that answer that all three were the same person. Bill, I wonder. This is a little uncouth to mention, but the Roman slang for, shall we say, lady of negotiable affection was she-wolf. Oh, I didn't know that. As such, I wonder if there's a bit of slang here for this that's being missed, right? So earlier we saw that, at least according to one opinion, this Cyrus, who was corrupt in his personal life, possibly engaging in bestiality, possibly just lavishing affection on a dog in a way that he was not, ready to do for people, like treating his pet much better than he treated, other people. But possibly this idea that it was, this female dog engaging in bestiality, so almost like, was it literal? Was it figurative? Hard to tell. We're not going to this is not a history text, right? We're not going to get to the bottom of it. For one reason or another, at some point, the sort of national Jewish opinion of King Cyrus became at least conflicted, even though he had done a lot of good for the Jewish people. Later, he was considered a corrupt king, and we see that even with the Jewish kings, that there are some Jewish kings who did very righteous things and then later became corrupt, or vice versa. Menashe was a totally corrupt king who spent 30 years atoning for the evil that he did in his youth. And it's unclear whether he, through that atonement, earned a position for himself in the world to come. You'd think that atonement is always open to us. Why did 30 years of penance not make up for the 20 corrupt years? Because it wasn't just about his personal corruption. His decrees caused so many Jews to engage in idolatry that, the ripple effect of that was tremendous, right? The sages are going to be very loath to forgive a Jewish king who leads the nation into idolatry. That's sort of like the biggest sin of all, not just engaging in idolatry, but leading others to commit idolatry. Finally, Seraphim. So the title of Mashiach, anointed one, as it was bestowed upon King Koresh, the Hebrew for Cyrus, does not much reflect his character, I guess. That's what we're learning, right? They were incredibly grateful to him when he enabled them to rebuild the temple. But then maybe later it came to their attention that, he engaged in practices that were very unsavory. I mean, we can only speculate so much. It's just, like we don't have a history text before us. We haven't engaged in good research, looked at other sources, really looked at all the source texts even within the Bible. It seems like a lot of them were named here. But, I think we'd have to do a closer reading of Ezra, of Nehemiah, of Haggai before we could really, comment on this. This is just for the purposes of today. We saw that, is a foreign king going to be considered righteous or not? Is not going to be a simple answer to that question. And that's what I've got today. All right, my friends, great to be learning with you. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night for Tractate Rosh Hashana, page 5. And don't forget, tomorrow's Thursday, 11:30 a.m. Pacific. We will have the band 8th Day on AT Live, right? We'll be on Facebook Live. They're going to be singing, playing guitar, and telling stories. It's going to be a great visit on AT Live. Catch it live so you can ask questions or see the replay later. It'll be on our Facebook page. Have a great night.